Jonah McGraw was trying to chop his memories in half when he heard the knock. The axe hung in the air, frozen. The silence of the mountains was his only friend, and it never, ever knocked. He stood dead still, breath turning to smoke in the brutal winter air. It was a sound so small, so out of place, it felt like a hallucination, a trick of the wind. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was timid, desperate, like a bird trying to break through a window to escape a storm. Nobody came this far up the ridge in winter. The trail was a death trap, swallowed by snow. The townspeople had long since written him off, a ghost in a log cabin haunted by his own past. Jonah lowered the axe. He didn't want visitors. He didn't want words. He wanted the clean crack of wood and the dull ache in his muscles that helped him forget. But that sound, that tiny, pleading sound, it pulled at something he thought was long dead. His boots crunched on the frozen ground as he walked to the door. He didn't own a gun, but his hands were heavy and calloused, weapons in their own right. He pulled the heavy wooden door inward, ready for anything. A lost trapper, a starving wolf. He wasn't ready for the girl. She was impossibly small, no taller than his knee. Her hair was a mess of brown tangles, her cheeks scraped raw by the wind. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, but her eyes were ancient, wide, terrified, and knowing. She clung to the doorframe with tiny frozen fists, as if she expected the world to rip her away. Then she spoke, and the words were like shards of ice. "They whipped my mama," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "She hurts bad, please help." Jonah just stared. The cold air rushed in, but he didn't feel it. All he could see were the faint purple bruises blooming on the little girl's jawline. He saw the way her small body shivered inside a dress made of little more than flour sacking. A dress meant for autumn, not for the jaws of a mountain winter. For 4 years, he had been a stone, a man made of silence and grief. But in that moment, something deep inside him, an ember he thought had been extinguished with his wife, flickered. It fought for air. It wanted to live. He didn't say a word. He never said a word. But he bent down, scooped the child into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bundle of dry twigs, and stepped back inside. He closed the door on the howling wind, and in doing so, he opened a door to a storm he couldn't possibly imagine. The girl's name was Clara. She whispered it between shivering sobs as he wrapped her in a thick wool blanket by the fire. She pointed a trembling finger toward the foothills, toward an old abandoned barn that was slowly surrendering to the weight of the snow. Jonah didn't hesitate. He pulled on his heaviest coat, lifted the child again, and stepped back into the blizzard. The wind shrieked, clawing at him, trying to tear Clara from his arms. But he leaned into it, his boots sinking deep, each step a battle. He was a man walking into the heart of the storm that had brought him this strange, broken gift. He found the barn, just as she'd said. It was a skeleton of a building, boards groaning, the roof half collapsed. Inside, the cold was somehow even worse. And there, on a pile of frozen hay, was a woman. Her name was Elsie Carter. She looked to be about 28, but life had carved cruel lines around her eyes. Her dress was torn and streaked with mud and something darker. Blood. A cut on her lip, another on her brow. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a trampled flower, still fragrant amidst the ruin. When Jonah stepped through the broken doorway, her head turned. Shame flickered in her eyes first, then a wave of pure animal pain. "Please," she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. "Don't let them find us." Them. The same word the girl had used. Jonah knelt, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He slid his arms beneath her, lifting her as easily as he would a fallen log. She let out a sharp gasp, part pain, part shock. He could feel the tremors running through her body. He carried her out of the barn, back into the white chaos of the snow. Clara followed close behind, a tiny shadow struggling to keep up, her small footprints erased by the wind, almost as soon as they were made. Back in the cabin, the firelight painted the scene in flickering shades of orange and black. Jonah laid Elsie gently on the small cot he rarely used. The warmth made the bruises on her face seem darker, uglier. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was unnerving. He fetched water. He tore a clean rag. He began to clean her wounds. His hands, which could split an oak log with a single blow, were surprisingly gentle. Clara huddled in the blanket, her wide eyes tracking his every move, trying to decide if this silent giant was a savior or just another monster. Elsie flinched as he dabbed at the cut on her brow, but she didn't cry out. She'd learned long ago to swallow her pain. "I have nothing," she murmured, her gaze locked on the dancing flames. "Nothing left but trouble, not worth a good man's time." Jonah didn't answer. He just continued his work, but for a fleeting second his eyes met hers, and she saw it. A grief that was older and deeper than her own, a sorrow so profound it had become a part of the man himself. He finished cleaning her cuts, placed a cup of fresh water by the cot, and then retreated to his chair by the fire. He sat there for hours, staring into the embers as if searching for an answer he knew he wouldn't find. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the cabin, burying the trails, burying whatever secrets this woman and her child had brought to his door. The days that followed were a slow, quiet thaw. Elsie's strength returned in small, fragile pieces. She found his sewing kit and began mending one of his shirts, her hands still stiff and bruised, but her stitches were neat and precise. It was her way of paying a debt. Clara, seeming to sense that the immediate danger had passed, began to explore the small cabin. She found a patch of stubborn winter wildflowers peeking through the snow near the woodpile and placed them in a cup on the rough-hewn table. A tiny splash of color in a world of gray and white. Jonah said little, but he acted. He chopped twice as much wood as usual, stacking it high beside the hearth. He made sure the fire never went out. He was offering warmth, the only comfort he knew how to give. They didn't talk about what happened. They didn't talk about the men. The word "they" hung in the air, unspoken, a ghost at their small table. But in the shared silence, something was growing, a fragile tendril of trust, taking root in the frozen ground of their lives. But the mountain wasn't the whole world. Sooner or later, he had to go to town for supplies, and that's when he heard the whispers. He saw it in the way the women at the general store pulled their shawls tighter when he walked in. He heard it in the snickers of the men loitering outside the saloon. "McGraw's got himself some company," they'd mutter, just loud enough for him to hear. "A woman with a past. Damaged goods." The words were like ice picks, chipping away at the wall of silence he'd built around himself. It was a different kind of cold, a meaner kind. He kept his head down, bought his flour and coffee, and left without a word. But he could feel their eyes on his back, judging, condemning. He returned to the cabin with the town's poison clinging to him. Elsie saw it on his face the moment he walked through the door. She knew that look. She'd seen it her whole life. That evening, as the fire crackled and the wind moaned outside, she spoke. "I can leave," she said softly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wouldn't look at him. "You've been kind, kinder than anyone. I won't have your name ruined because of us." Jonah looked at her. He looked at her for a long, long time. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and heavy. He looked at her bruised face, her mended shirt, and the fierce, stubborn pride that refused to be extinguished. Then, in a voice rough from years of disuse, he said two words. "Doors open." It wasn't a promise of protection. It wasn't a declaration of love. But for Elsie, who had only ever known doors being slammed in her face, those two words were everything. It meant choice. It meant she wasn't a prisoner here. And that made all the difference. Tears she hadn't shed for her own pain now slipped freely down her cheeks. She bowed her head, hiding them from his view. But little Clara, who understood things in a way adults couldn't, walked over and slipped her tiny hand into Jonah's massive one. She squeezed it, a silent thank you from a child who had found her protector. But as winter deepened, so did the shadows. The warmth inside the cabin was a small, flickering candle in a vast, encroaching darkness. Jonah found himself listening to the sound of Elsie humming a lullaby to Clara, a sound that was so foreign and yet so welcome in the crushing silence he had called home. He found himself watching the way the firelight caught the red in her hair. These weren't feelings he could name, they were just sparks, tiny sparks in the cold, dead furnace of his heart. Then one night, the storm outside raged, howling like a pack of wolves. A nightmare woke Clara from her sleep. She whimpered, then crawled out of her small bedroll and padded over to Jonah's chair. She climbed onto his lap, pressing her little head against his broad chest, seeking comfort from the man who smelled of pine and safety. "Pa," she whispered. The word was so quiet, so natural, it might have been carried on the wind. But to Jonah, it was a lightning strike. He went rigid. The memory of his wife, her belly swollen with the child they would never meet, crashed over him. The grief was so sharp, so sudden, it stole his breath. For 4 years, he had been nothing but a widower, a ghost. But this small, warm weight in his arms, this was real. He closed his eyes, his calloused hand coming to rest on Clara's tangled hair. He didn't push her away. From the cot, Elsie watched through the darkness. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the tremor in his breath that he tried to hide. She saw the silent war raging inside the stone-faced man. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that something had just shifted. The ground beneath them had cracked. Outside, the snow fell faster, burying their tracks, isolating them completely. But they weren't alone. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges, the men who had done this to her were still looking. Their cruelty was a hungry thing, and it hadn't been fed. And inside the cabin, a fragile, dangerous bond had just been sealed, a bond that could save them or get them all killed. The first sign of the real storm wasn't a rider on the horizon. It was a man wearing a tarnished silver star. Sheriff Boone Talbot didn't ride up the trail like a man on official business. He rode like a man who owned the ground his horse stepped on. He swung down from the saddle, his boots landing with a soft thud in the deep snow. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a predator's smile. "McGraw," he drawled, his voice lazy but laced with menace. He stomped the snow off his boots on the porch. "Heard you took in some strays." Jonah had been splitting wood. He didn't put the axe down. He just stood there, a silent mountain of a man, blocking the cabin door. Boone's eyes flickered past Jonah, trying to get a look inside. "Word is the woman you're keeping is claimed by a very important man, a man named Silas Crowley." Jonah's grip on the axe handle tightened. He knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Crowley owned the biggest mine, the saloon, half the businesses in town. He owned people. "Crowley don't take kindly to people touching his property," Boone continued, his smile widening. The word property hung in the cold air, ugly and sharp. Jonah's face was stone. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any threat Boone could utter. The sheriff's smile finally faltered. He saw something in Jonah's eyes. Something that wasn't fear. It was the flat, dead-end stare of a man with nothing left to lose. "Just a friendly warning," Boone spat, turning back to his horse. "Crowley gets what he wants. Always." He rode off, leaving a trail of poison behind him. That night the silence in the cabin was different. It was heavy, charged with unspoken fear. Elsie was staring into the fire, her hands twisting a loose thread on her dress. "His name is Silas Crowley," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He thinks he owns me." She looked up at Jonah, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of shame and defiance. "He thinks he owns everyone, but I won't go back. I won't let him have Clara." She took a shaky breath. I saw something, Jonah. Something I wasn't supposed to see. That's why he sent his men. That's why he sent the sheriff. It's not just about me. It's about what I know. Before Jonah could process this, Clara, who had been listening from her bedroll, spoke up. Her voice was small but clear. He's a bad man, Pa. A monster. There it was again. That word. Pa. This time it didn't break him. It forged him. The grief was still there, a hot coal in his chest. But now there was something else alongside it. A cold, hard certainty. He wasn't just a widower hiding from the world anymore. He was the man this little girl called Pa. He was the wall that stood between this family and the monster. He looked from Clara's trusting face to Elsie's terrified but resolute one. He gave a single, slow nod. It was a promise, a declaration of war. They didn't have to wait long for the war to come to them. It was dusk, a few days later. The sky was bleeding purple and red over the snow-covered peaks, and then they appeared. 4 riders, dark silhouettes against the dying light. Silas Crowley was in the lead. He was a big man, dressed in a fine black coat that seemed out of place in the rugged wilderness. His face was fleshy and cruel. Beside him rode the sheriff, Boone Talbot, his star glinting. The other 2 were hired muscle, their faces hard and mean. Jonah stepped out onto the porch before they could even dismount. He held his old hunting rifle. He didn't raise it, but he held it like it was a part of his arm. McGraw. Crowley's voice boomed across the clearing, a voice used to giving orders and being obeyed. You've got something that belongs to me. Send the woman and the girl out. Do it now, and I'll forget this whole thing ever happened. Jonah didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, solid as the mountain behind him. Boone Talbot laughed, a nasty, grating sound. Don't be a fool, McGraw. This ain't your fight. She's just a whore who ran out on her bill. From inside the cabin, Elsie heard the word. She flinched as if struck, but then something inside her snapped. She had been running her whole life. She had been hiding. She was done. She grabbed Clara's hand, walked to the door, and pushed it open. She stood beside Jonah, her small frame trembling, but her head held high. I am not your property, Silas, she said, her voice shaking but clear, and you will not touch my daughter. Crowley's face twisted into a mask of rage. You stupid woman, you have no idea what you've done. He reached for the pistol on his hip, and all hell broke loose. Jonah's rifle cracked, the sound echoing like a thunderclap across the valley. One of Crowley's men screamed and fell from his horse, clutching a shattered shoulder. The clearing erupted in a chaos of shouting, gunfire, and panicked horses. Jonah moved with a brutal economy of motion. He wasn't a gunslinger, but he was a survivor. He used the rifle as a club, smashing it into the face of the second gunman, sending him sprawling into the snow. Crowley was firing wildly, bullets splintering the wood of the cabin porch. Boone was advancing, his own pistol drawn, that ugly grin back on his face. He was enjoying this. Elsie, seeing Boone take aim at Jonah, did the only thing she could. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from beside the door and hurled it with all her might. It caught the sheriff square in the side of the head. He staggered, stunned, his shot going wide. That was the opening Jonah needed. He lunged forward, ignoring Crowley, and slammed his fist into Boone's jaw. The sheriff went down hard, his head hitting the icy porch with a sickening crack. Crowley saw his advantage was gone. He was a bully, not a fighter. He cursed, fired one last shot that went nowhere, and spurred his horse back down the trail, the one uninjured gunman scrambling after him. The silence that fell was sudden and absolute. It was broken only by the whimpering of the man with the broken shoulder, the crackle of the fire inside, and the sound of 3 people breathing heavily, their breath fogging in the frigid air. Elsie rushed to Jonah's side, her hand hovering over his arm. checking for wounds. Clara ran out and wrapped her arms around his legs, burying her face against him. They had won. They had survived the first battle. But as Jonah looked down the trail where Crowley had fled, he knew this wasn't over. A man like that didn't just give up. He didn't forget. He would be back. And next time, he would bring an army. Later that night, after they had tied up the injured gunman and tended to their own minor scrapes, the truth finally came out. The whole truth. They sat by the fire, the cabin door bolted shut. The world outside was dark and silent. Elsie's hands were shaking as she held a cup of hot coffee. "He's not just a powerful man, Jonah," she began, her voice low and strained. "He's a monster in a fine suit. I worked for him. Not in the way the town thinks. I was his bookkeeper. I'm good with numbers." She took a shaky breath. He kept 2 sets of books, one for the taxman, one for himself. The real one. It detailed everything. How he cheated miners out of their claims, how he blackmailed the mayor, how he bought the sheriff. It listed names, dates, amounts, everything. Jonah listened, his face grim. This was worse than he imagined. "But that's not the worst of it," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "There were other payments for accidents. A bridge collapse that killed 3 men who wouldn't sell their land. A cave-in at a rival mine. Payments to men who made problems disappear." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a terrible shared grief. "There was a name in that ledger, Jonah. A payment made 4 years ago. For a mining accident. An accident that killed a foreman who was trying to start a union. A man named Thomas Miller." Jonah froze. The coffee cup in his hand felt impossibly heavy. Thomas Miller was his wife's brother. "After Tom died," Elsie continued, her voice cracking, "his wife, your Sarah, she didn't believe it was an accident. She said Tom was too careful. She started asking questions. She went to the sheriff, to Boone, and he told her to go home and mourn. But she didn't stop." The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. Jonah felt the floor drop out from under him. He knew what was coming. He had known it in some dark, buried part of his soul for 4 long years. A week later, Elsie said, sobbing now, they found her. At the bottom of the ravine. They said she slipped. They said she died of a broken heart. Jonah closed his eyes. The memory of finding her, broken and cold, ripped through him. He had accepted the story. He had let the grief swallow him whole. He had hidden himself away on this mountain, believing it was just a cruel twist of fate. But it wasn't fate. It was murder. All this time, he had been mourning a tragedy. But he should have been hunting a killer. Silas Crowley hadn't just taken this woman's freedom. He had taken Jonah's entire world. The rage that filled him was nothing like the hot, chaotic anger of the fight. This was cold. It was calm. It was the absolute soul-deep certainty of a glacier. It moved slowly, but it would crush everything in its path. He looked at Elsie, her face streaked with tears. He looked at Clara, sleeping peacefully in her bedroll, unaware of the ghosts that filled the room. This wasn't just their fight anymore. It was his. He stood up and walked to the small chest where he kept his wife's things. He opened it for the first time in 4 years. He pushed aside a lace handkerchief and a book of pressed flowers. Underneath was his father's old Colt revolver, cleaned and oiled. He had never had a reason to wear it. Now he did. He strapped the gun belt around his waist. It felt heavy. It felt right. "He won't come back here," Jonah said, his voice a low rumble, "because I'm going to him." Elsie's eyes widened. "Jonah, no. He'll kill you. He has the whole town in his pocket." "He had the town," Jonah corrected her, checking the chambers of the revolver. "But pockets have holes. And you, Elsie, you're the one who's going to help me tear them open." He wasn't the silent man of the mountain anymore. The ghost of Jonah McGraw was gone, and the man who stood in his place was heading down the mountain to collect a debt written in blood. The next morning, Jonah didn't just take his axe. He took the ledger, the one Elsie had managed to steal before she fled. It was her insurance policy, the one thing that kept Crowley from simply putting a bullet in her back from a distance. It was the proof of everything. And it was now his weapon. He rode into town not as a hermit, but as an avenging angel. He left Elsie and Clara at the cabin, the door barred, his rifle loaded and propped by the window. He trusted her to protect their home. His job was to burn down the snake pit. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He didn't go to the saloon. He went to the church. It was Sunday. The pews were filled with the good, God-fearing people of the town. The same people who whispered behind his back. The same people who paid Crowley's exorbitant fees and lived in fear of his thugs. Jonah walked right down the center aisle as the preacher was in the middle of a sermon about false idols. The entire congregation turned, their mouths agape. Jonah McGraw, the silent widower, was in church, and he was armed. He stepped up to the pulpit, ignoring the sputtering preacher. He held up the ledger. "You all know me," he began, his voice echoing in the shocked silence. "You know I've kept to myself these last 4 years. I was mourning my wife. That's what you all thought. That's what I thought." He opened the book. "I was wrong. My wife Sarah didn't die of a broken heart. She was murdered, and the man who ordered her death is sitting right there." He pointed, not at Crowley, not yet. He pointed at Sheriff Boone Talbot, whose face had gone white as a sheet. "Sheriff Boone told my wife to stop asking questions about her brother's death. This book says he was paid $500 the day after she was found. Blood money from Silas Crowley." A collective gasp went through the church. People turned to look at Boone, who was half rising from his pew, his hand reaching for his gun. "And that's not all," Jonah's voice boomed. He started reading names. "Jedediah Smith, your farm. Foreclosed on and bought for 10 cents on the dollar by Crowley after your barn mysteriously burned down. This book says Crowley paid 2 men to light that fire." He flipped a page. "Martha O'Malley. Your son was sent to prison for a theft he swore he didn't commit. This book says Boone was paid to plant the evidence because your son wouldn't work for starvation wages in Crowley's mine." He went on, name after name, crime after crime, the secret history of their town laid bare in the house of God. With every sentence, the fear in the room began to curdle into anger. The people were looking at each other, seeing their own private tragedies mirrored in their neighbors' eyes. They weren't isolated victims. They were a town under siege. From the back of the church, Silas Crowley stood up, his face purple with rage. "Lies, all of it. This man is a grief-crazed lunatic. Seize him," he roared at Boone. But Boone was frozen. He was looking at the faces around him, the faces of the people he was sworn to protect, now staring at him with cold, hard hatred. His hand dropped from his gun. "You're a fool, McGraw," Crowley snarled, pulling his own ornate pistol. "I own this town. I own all of you." He fired a shot at the ceiling, trying to intimidate the crowd. It was a fatal mistake. It wasn't fear that answered him, it was rage. Jedediah Smith, the farmer who'd lost everything, let out a roar and charged at Crowley. 2 other miners, whose friends had died in Crowley's accidents, were right behind him. The church erupted into chaos. It wasn't a mob. It was an uprising. Jonah ignored them. His eyes were locked on Boone. The sheriff, seeing his power evaporate, made a desperate move. He drew his pistol and aimed it at Jonah. But Jonah was ready. His Colt was in his hand before Boone could even cock the hammer. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Boone crumpled to the floor, his tarnished star clattering on the wooden planks. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't a threat anymore. By the time the dust settled, Silas Crowley was beaten and bloody, held down by the very people he had terrorized for years. His reign was over. The town had taken its power back. Jonah walked out of the church, the heavy ledger still in his hand. The sun was bright. The air felt clean for the first time in years. He had walked into town seeking revenge, but he had found something more: justice. He rode back up the mountain trail, not as a ghost, but as a man with a future. When he reached the cabin, the door flew open. Elsie stood there, rifle in hand, her face pale with worry. Clara peeked out from behind her skirts. He swung down from his horse, walked over to her, and gently took the rifle from her hands. He looked into her eyes. "It's over," he said. And in those two words, she heard the promise of a life free from fear, a life where doors stayed open not as an escape route, but as a welcome. The winter snows began to melt the following weeks, revealing the green life that had been sleeping underneath. The town began to heal, rebuilding itself on a foundation of truth instead of lies. They put Boone and Crowley on a prison wagon and sent them far, far away. Jonah, Elsie, and Clara didn't move. The cabin on the mountain was no longer a place of exile. It was a home. The silence was gone. It was replaced by the sound of Clara's laughter as she chased butterflies. It was replaced by the sound of Elsie's humming as she planted a small garden. It was replaced by the quiet, comfortable conversations that filled the long, warm evenings. One day, Jonah was teaching Clara how to skip stones on the newly thawed creek. She looked up at him, her face serious. "Are you my pa now?" she asked. "For real?" Jonah looked over at Elsie, who was watching them with a soft smile. He looked back down at the little girl who had knocked on his door and woken him from a 4-year nightmare. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the weathered lines on his face. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for real." He had gone into the mountains to bury his heart, but life, in its strange and stubborn way, had followed him. It had knocked on his door in the form of a little girl and a broken woman, and it had demanded to be let in. And in saving them, he had finally, truly, saved himself. What do you think makes someone a hero? Is it the big, loud battles or the quiet, everyday choices? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more tales of justice from the dark corners of history.